have people join?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi everyone, Julie here from Feedfeed.
And I'm Judy here from the Judy Lab.
And as you know, we've mentioned a couple of times on Instagram and on Twitter that we're just going to take a couple minutes today to show you how to make a couple of decorative pies for your holiday dinner. We have a couple of pies here. Here's one of the finished pies that we've shown a couple of times. We showed the unbaked version, and here's the baked. And this is Judy's masterpiece.
Thanks. It's been fun. I'm the editor of the Pie Crust Inspiration feed, and it's been a lot of fun to sort of play with it. And over the year, I've been figuring out how to get the right recipe for the crust that kind of works with doing decorative, and also something that really tastes delicious, because that's something that's really not worth sacrificing.
Right. You see all these beautiful pies, and the crust designs are so elaborate, and I'm often wondering how they're going to taste.
Yeah. And I learned along the way, and that's kind of the fun of baking, is that you learn by trial and error. And I think a lot of people say, like, I'm not into baking, but I'd say just go for it. There's just no better way than just practicing.
So I also want to take a second to thank our sponsor, Driscoll's. They have supplied the raspberries for today. So the filling of this pie is a pear and cardamom mixture with a raspberry and tapioca. And so we're going to be putting it together actually right now. So maybe I'll just get started.
Yeah. I'm just going to talk a little bit about pie crusts, since dough recipes are kind of important, while Julie's just sort of demonstrating how to sort of roll out the dough. And I went from basically like a classic pâte brisée, which is just a fancy French word for saying, pastry, pie pastry. You can use them for galettes, but I've been using because it was all butter and tastes great.
Oh, there's my pie.
Pie done. Cooking a pie.
I'll get that.
And but now I've gone to the point where I wanted to taste flakier and more tender. And someone gave me this tip once. I wish I could remember who, but it was to use vodka. And water seems to be it's sort of like the enemy in terms of creating a tough dough, and it has something to do with the gluten. So vodka is something that A, evaporates, and B, doesn't really increase gluten. So that's a really great trick. And I like to make a much wetter dough than typical, and it makes it easier to roll out. It doesn't get crumbly, and I have a little bit less wastage. So that's something I like, and that's something we have up on my website and also on Julie's website. So please check it out and give comments.
Yeah, so by adding the vodka, the crust is still flaky, even though you have more liquid than a traditional pâte brisée.
Exactly. A lot of them have just a couple of tablespoons, but I find that it's really hard to roll out. And I like to use a food processor, and I used to be all about using the, what do you call it, the pastry pastry cutters,
yes,
right?
Right. I still do the old school with 2 knives, like my mom always used to do. Yeah.
And but they're all good. It's just that the food processor makes it so that you can incorporate the liquid more evenly distributed all throughout it. And so I found that it was just like a little bit faster, and it kind of it made it easier in my case. But everyone's got their own thing.
Luckiest Duck just mentioned that Cooks Illustrated made the original vodka.
I was
Crush.
actually wondering if they were the original, and they are the inspiration for, once I had heard about the vodka, they were my go-to. And on my recipe, I definitely credit them for being, they were the inspiration, and that's where I adapted it from. But it also came a little bit from Martha Stewart's pâte brisée, and I know that other people are, butter versus shortening.
Right.
There's the big debate. I don't know.
This is actually half butter and half shortening that we're using here, and that's the recipe that we have worked on and we're happy with.
Yeah, actually it has more butter. I think it just has a better flavor, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean the butter, I still, I've tried to get an all butter that works well with decorative crusts, and I think that a little bit of shortening does do the trick. So why don't you...
Yeah, and one thing about the shortening, it's a little bit of a relief, because it when you put it in, it doesn't freeze completely, and also so does the vodka. So I tend to, put the crust into the freezer a lot, just to kind of keep it from...
Oh, that's...
Is that just a timer?
No, I got it. Okay.
Oh,
so do you want to start putting the lattice on, Judy?
Exactly. So we have cut a couple of lattice pieces already, and it's based on this pie right here, which is what we're going for in terms of design. And I'm making it a slightly different version in the sense that there are wide strips about 2 inches, and then there was a combination of twisted ones and flat ones. And when I baked it, I just kind of liked the twisted ones better. They came out with a nice little texture.
Yeah,
and
that's
crunch.
a nice technique. I haven't seen that before.
And the nice thing is that when I go up to design something, like sometimes I'll do little chicken scratch notes, like little illustrations to figure out. So this was my initial idea, and I called it tartan plaid, and little crisscross with the different sized lattice pieces. But now I wanted to just make them either twisted or wide, and so I'm just going to show you quickly. Just take a regular roller, honestly, and little pastry wheel. You could use I suppose like a pizza wheel.
Yeah.
If you didn't have one.
Right.
So
or even a knife. A knife is fine.
Yep, a knife is great, and
or a pastry knife. I have a pastry knife that I use often.
And we want to emphasize, I tend to use these little gadgets and things, which we'll talk about in a second. But pie making is about using whatever you have. So.
Somebody asked what kind of pie that is. I don't know if we.
Oh, so this is a pear and cardamom with raspberry and tapioca. And it's actually a Driscoll's recipe, so we're happy with the results. We've tasted another one earlier, and it's delicious. And we have that link in our Instagram profile right now if you want to check it out.
So just going to kind of show, we're all human people here. So this one is a little crumpled, and it's a matter of how thick the dough is, and these came out pretty evenly, but you can sort of see at the end they started breaking a little bit, and that's just because the dough got a little bit thin, or maybe the butter started getting a little bit warm. So we're leaving a lot of stuff out, but normally we wouldn't have everything out at once, so that your butter is staying cold,
right.
And that when it hits that heat, the steam is what's creating that nice bit of flaky texture and puff of air. So
one thing to mention about the recipe is that we actually cut the pears a little thinner than was mentioned in the Driscoll's recipe, and that was because we decided not to pre-bake or pre-cook the pears. So these pears are raw, and you can see it's about 1/8 of an inch thick in terms of the thickness of the pears. So we put that directly into the pastry. So now we're going to move this over. And
we'll start showing you how to put the lattice together. The other reason that this dough recipe that I like to use that's been adapted is that it gives you some freedom so that this dough is actually a little less, it's just more pliable. You can kind of see. This is a little bit on the thicker side. You can play with it. I often find that most recipes, they almost never say what thickness to go to. And I think they're trying to basically tell you,
well, it's a matter of preference, right?
Yeah.
Some people like, the crust is some people's favorite part of a pie.
Exactly.
So they might go with a little bit of a thicker crust, whereas others might go thinner.
Exactly. So, on the Feedfeed, the Pie Inspiration page is something I go to sometimes to get some ideas, or I'll just, look up hashtags for pie crust or whatever it may be. And I notice that a lot of lattices tend to be perpendicular, and I thought this was kind of nice to sort of make it a little bit on an angle. So I'm going to do that. And
is the dough pretty sticky to work with? Cook pretty wet fast?
It's actually
not.
And I put a lot of flour on it today just because I didn't want anything to stick while we were on camera, and just to make it a little easier for ourselves. But
no, it's actually a pretty dry, but it's not brittle, and it's not breaking, which is nice.
Exactly. So really you're just going to go back and forth when you're doing it in an exact crisscross. It's a little bit different. So I'm kind of doing it kind of in different pieces here, but you just want to pay attention to one is going over and one is going under, and gonna put this here.
And while Judy's talking about doing that, what I wanted to mention is that you can always put foil around the outside of your pie to keep the edges from browning. And then this is something that I think my mom sent me this several years ago, and I often use this. Just put it around the outside of the pie to keep the edges from browning, and it's just a nice, perfect circle and works really well. That way, you get the nice color, but it doesn't get too dark while the center is still cooking.
The other thing is that when you're working with something that's got berries or something like that, when you're flipping them back and forth, just, you know, if you want it to look really nice and pristine and clean, just be aware because it'll stain the dough as you're going for it. So, you know, I'm going to keep this one kind of on the simple side just for demonstration. And then there was a pair of scissors here, Joel.
Oh, I think we put them over here.
No. Yeah. So, I mean, you could use a knife, but sometimes I find like a pair of really nice kitchen shears so that you can just trim all this as you're going. And some people like to go over or under on tucking in the edges. So, you know, I think you can sort of play with it what you
How
like.
do you do it?
You know, I was doing it forward, but then I saw someone else's and I liked that it went under and they just tucked the pieces with it, and it seems so kind of neat. But in this case, it's not really going to matter because we're going to put this double leaf pattern on the outside, so it's not going to be as important. So.
Somebody asked where you can get the cover for the crust.
These, probably any specialty shop online. I would say check out Williams-Sonoma.
Yeah, it's a pretty common kitchen
a silicone tool. Yeah.
There are different kinds. There's silicone ones. I think they're a little bit more forgiving and easier to use. They're the ones that are adjustable, that are hard.
Yes, I used to have those. I think I actually prefer this. You have to get this at the right size of your pie pan. So if you're working with a 9-inch, you'd need the 9-inch. So make sure you know the size of your pie pan if you're going to order these. So
exactly. So like size. This one, I think we tested it out.
Yeah, actually earlier today I was looking at it and you see it doesn't fit on this one because I think this is probably 9.5 or 10 inches.
So you can see that this is getting a little bit messy, but you'll see in the end it won't matter. Thanks, Joel. Right. Because it's going to get...
You're doing under.
I'm going to go under.
Okay.
And what would you say, what kind of pie dish is best to use? Glass or tin? Or...
I prefer these glass.
Like
the Pyrex.
Generally they're Pyrex.
Right. Which is a really thick, shatterproof, safe. Also, I find that it's a little bit more forgiving if you're not that, if you don't know, and maybe you're visiting someone and you're making a pie at their house. I took them out of the freezer. If you're making a pie at someone's house and you haven't cooked in that oven before, it's nice to have this because often the tin, they might burn on the bottom.
Somebody actually asked an unrelated question about apple pies, what the best apples are to use.
Well, I think in general it's nice to have a variety of apples or...
tart and sweet and...
Yes, exactly. So, you know, you can go... And even color, you know, it's nice to get some that were red and some that were green. The green tend to be the tartar and some of the red are sweeter, but not always.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends. Oops.
Same probably goes for the pears when you use pears if you can get
Correct. These are local pears, so we worked with what we have, but you could definitely get a variety.
You know, it's nice. When I go to the farmer's market, sometimes I have this grand plan. I get to the farmer's market and I ask them, do you have these pears?
Right.
And they go, they're not in season yet. And I said, okay, well, just tell them what you're making. And they usually have a great recommendation. They'll say, oh, well, this is really simple. You know, it's very similar.
Right.
And it'll give you a tart flavor, or this will give you a much more watery.
I would say, too, with pears, these pears, as you'll see, we actually have a few of them over there. They're not super ripe. You know, you want a harder pear in your desserts. You know, you, of course, don't have that problem with apples, but as pears ripen, they tend to get pretty soft.
Just letting you know what I'm doing here. So we kind of skipped a step, but what we ended up doing... Actually,
will you show how to punch these out just real quick?
Actually, you want to keep going with
sure. So as I'm going to continue to lay the leaves around the edges here, Judy will show you how to punch it out.
So we kind of left all these pieces that we had made a couple other pies, and we had left the actual trimmed pieces because this is actually, to me, like some people might toss this out because they don't know what to do with it, but this is a great place where you might want to use these cutters. So the difference between a cutter, which is kind of nice, you can get these at most specialty stores and also on an online shop, is that they have this little plunger, and so it makes it easy to cut, and then there's these little grooves here, so it'll give you this nice texture to them. I see people being so creative. They'll cut out leaves with a butter knife, and then they'll imitate those veins. This just makes it a lot easier because essentially you're just going to cut it out, pull away the dough, punch it just lightly and push it out, and you'll see that you'll get this nice sort of impression. If you find that it's sticking a little bit, maybe the butter is starting to get warm, you will just want to, you know, put it in a little bit of flour. Usually what I do is I put these on a sheet pan with some parchment paper, put them in the freezer, let them get completely frozen, and then you can just put them in a bowl and they won't stick to each other.
And you can actually keep them in a Tupperware in the freezer. And I saw you recently posted, I know, an egg dish where you pulled out a few of these little leaves and kind of baked it with your baked eggs.
Yeah, I mean, you can use them for anything to sort of give a sort of like a crunchy pastry flavor of some sort. And so, you know, I ended up throwing it with some eggs and, you know, some farro.
And now, so if someone doesn't have, you know, they don't want to buy these pie cutters.
Yeah.
What do you recommend?
So these actually, I feel like have been coming down in price, maybe because they're getting more popular.
Right.
And I think that more and more of those specialties, everyday stores are selling them. So if you don't see them, I would ask. And sometimes you can get a great deal right after Thanksgiving. Like there might be the Thanksgiving holiday ones, autumn leaves going on sale. But the Christmas snowflakes and the snowmen and, you know, things like that. So we're going to show you in a second. I think this is the one that we baked off, but this is just cute little, I think it's technically a rooster, but Thanksgiving's coming up. We're going to consider this a turkey. So I'm just going to cut this up.
Oops, I just put one right on this pie.
Oh, wow.
So somebody asked if that was egg wash for the leaves.
Yeah, so this is a mixture of the yolk and a little bit of heavy cream. So yes, this is an egg wash.
And then another question was if you put the leaves in the freezer.
We did put the leaves in the freezer, so these are actually pretty cold. As Judy mentioned, we had them on a sheet pan in the freezer, just a quarter sheet pan, and then once they froze, we took them off the sheet pan and we put them into these bowls, and you can see they don't stick together, which is nice.
And I just like kind of metal bowls because it just keeps them chilled, and then eventually I just put them into like a little pint container, you know, that they're, or some sort of Tupperware. Stick them in the freezer. You'll have them anytime. You can put them, you can bake them at 350 for a few minutes, put a little egg wash on it. I mean, if you're in a pinch, just, you know, milk. Or, you know, maybe even butter, but just like a tiny bit of fat, and then just watch until they're golden brown. You can put them on top of ice cream with berries, you know, whipped cream, or Micah's eggs. So, so just to sort of demonstrate what we were talking about, trying to imitate sort of this like pattern here. So maybe what I might do is to sort of accentuate the like leaf, the tail of this so-called turkey. You know, do something like this.
Which you did. That was nice. You actually did that on this pie.
Yep. So that was the pie that we just took out of the oven a few minutes ago. So this is pretty hot.
So here you can see we used that cutter, and it was the same mixture. It's the pear, cardamom, and raspberry pie.
So it gives, so you don't have to cut any vents like a typical, you know, full double crust pie. It has sort of built-in air holes, and so it has a nice golden crust. And that was just a simple classic crimp around the sides, so it's really forgiving, and you could use a fork, you know, any kind of way that you want to just sort of like finish it off and then top it with these, or, you know, there's so many shapes of different kinds of leaves.
So what kind of pies are you going to be making this year for Thanksgiving?
I'm a diehard for pumpkin pie.
Yeah.
I can't live it.
Oh, actually, I'm glad you mentioned that because we wanted to show you, we did make one other thing. So we,
oh, that's right, because you wanted to show what it would be like if you want to have like a custard-based pie.
So if you have a custard pie and you're thinking, okay, well, how do I do this with a pumpkin? You know, I want to do something a little more decorative. So we rolled out the dough, we put the base in, and then just like you've seen us doing here, we attach these leaves, and then we put this in the freezer. So you could do that first and then get your pumpkin filling ready. And then when you're ready, you just pour it in.
And it's a little bit different with when you're doing the lattice crust, but I always put the actual pie crust without the filling in the freezer before I do anything else. It just makes it really cold. And we let this sit out a little bit because we were taking pictures and stuff like that. But sometimes it's nice to make the leaves, the decorative leaves, a little bit thicker if you're going to do it around the edge, like a wreath like this, because they'll see how they're sort of curving around. They started to melt. Well, that's going to happen during the cooking process. So to prevent that from happening during it, like you want to make sure they're a little thicker, they're really ice cold, and then the minute that they hit the heat, they'll maintain a little better shape, I think. You know, but it's not a big deal. And when you have the edge, just watch that for burning.
Yep.
So
yeah, I would definitely cover this with like a nice.
that
thick
one might
piece
need
of
foil.
foil.
I feel like,
Yeah.
like it's an unusual shape. It's
Exactly.
a 6-inch mini, little pie shell. So, but
Somebody just said those turkeys look great on that pie. I don't think I've ever heard that.
Well, and this could even be fun for a savory pie, you know, if you were making
like a pot pie.
like a pot pie. Yeah, exactly. Because normally you would put just the top and then cut the vent holes. So I think that could be really fun the day after Thanksgiving. You could take some of the leftover turkey and make a pot pie with it, and instead make little turkeys on the top.
So one thing I'm just going to mention about here is I've seen some beautiful pies that are really organized perfectly and neatly, and I usually go for a little more rustic feel, also because it's forgiving, you know, in case I sort of mess up and don't put something in the right place. They look like fallen leaves, so we kind of went a little bit sort of in one direction, and then just sort of change direction. These are mostly one leaf pattern, and then this is another, so it's a little more like a maple.
On this one, you actually had two.
I did. That one I kind of mixed
Two
up
rows?
completely.
Okay.
And I thought this one will make it a little different, and we'll do kind of like one leaf
Uniform.
pattern like this. And then I just, brush it with the back, with a pastry brush. You can use your fingers.
Yeah.
You definitely don't need any kind of fancy tools of any sort. And, have fun with it. I mean, I don't normally do this always, but I did the little sketches because I was excited to do the video. But, just you sort of play with it, and having these little mini, I think it's kind of fun. You can make more, I don't know, what are you going to make for Thanksgiving actually?
Yeah, I always make pumpkin. Dan likes apples, so I usually throw that in. Even though, although I like mixing apples with cranberries.
Cranberry custard.
Yep. Last year I did
That's
make
a
a
good
cranberry with a vanilla custard, and that was
Sounds
delicious.
good.
My daughter's been requesting that.
Somebody asked if they're blind baking crust, is it okay to use the wreath type order?
If they're blind baking,
Well, actually what I would do, instead, we were just talking about this off camera before, I would bake the crust like a typical blind bake. You don't forget to prick it with the fork tines so that it doesn't bubble, which I've definitely had.
Do you use pie weights when you blind bake? Or
Yeah,
beans?
I do. So I punch it with some fork tines, and then
Yeah, we didn't do that here.
But we were gonna fill it,
That's
so
true.
I guess we kind of got away with it.
Yeah.
But fill it with the fork tines to make a little perforation so it doesn't puff up. And then put some parchment paper, and you can fill it with. You can buy the fancy pie weights, but you can also buy beans.
Yeah,
and then you can
use
reuse
beans.
them. So it's a tip. You put them in a jar, you put them in the cupboard, and you bring them out. Don't eat them. Don't eat them. And then for the leaves, what I do is I put these on a sheet pan, cook them, bake them at 350, do a little egg wash, and then have them pre-cooked. And when you
Finish the pie, then add them at the end.
Yeah.
And otherwise, they'll get too dark.
Well,
I think
also,
they'll
you know
just
what
be
happens, and I can tell you because I've done this and it was a perfect fail. The pie pieces started falling into the custard.
Right,
And I was like,
yeah.
well,
Right, it needs to be solidified. And
yeah.
cooked,
I mean, there's a lot of learning by just trial and error. There's no better way. So,
What fruits would you recommend pairing with raspberries?
Well, so in this case, we're using the pears.
I like cranberries. I made a cranberry
apple.
Actually, I kind of at the kitchen sink. I think I called it.
Yeah.
It was raspberries, blackberries, apple, and pear.
Mm-hmm.
And then I always like to keep it fresh no matter what the flavors are. So in the recipe, there's two things that we were talking about. I always do, whether the recipe calls for it or not. I put the zest of the citrus,
Usually they call for lemon juice.
but not always the zest. I don't know
I
why,
do
but
the
it
same.
tastes really, really good.
Right.
And the second thing is we always put, I put little cubes of butter, and it kind of helps to make that sort of gooey sauce.
Yeah.
This one has tapioca in it, so I think, it turns out great because it gives that nice consistency, but that's something you have to watch out when you're using berries versus apples and pears is a really forgiving,
Because
recipe.
there's not as much liquid. It's not as watery.
It's like
the
the
pectin.
pectin.
Right.
Pectin. So that's one tip. And something that came up earlier in terms of making crust, I actually, sometimes if I know I'm going to make pie crust, I cut the butter in advance and stick it
in the freezer.
It doesn't have to be in a bowl, but something, and I put it in the freezer, and so that the minute that I'm ready to make pie dough, it is, you know, I don't even have to cut it. It's like ready to go.
Sure.
So.
Butter or shortening, someone asked.
Well, so this particular recipe is about skewing a little bit more on the butter side.
It's like a little more than 3/4, you know, percentage.
So this is a mixture of butter and shortening, and we've found that for using the vodka in the crust in order to and using a little more liquid. I mean, for me, you know, I really like a flaky pastry. So you know, when I first saw the amounts, even in the Cooks Illustrated, it's more liquid than I'm used to working with, but it works.
And mine's even more, which might freak people out a little bit. But like I said, in my head notes, I say, you know, start off maybe with, it's a full cup actually. I do a 1/2 cup of vodka and a 1/2 cup of water. You know, do the mixture, make sure it's ice cold, and make sure at least the vodka, no matter what, is definitely that 1/2 cup.
Right.
It's easier to go from there. And you know, as you're pulsing it through on the feed tube of a food processor, you know, just sort of watch it, you know, and
yeah, because every once in a while you will notice, like, you make it and you don't need as much water or liquid or
I don't know, maybe
vodka
like the time of the year, weather, humidity.
Right, the humidity could be a factor.
And in this case, actually, I don't know if you guys can see this, but this pastry is it's actually a different pastry than this. I did a little test with making a vodka pâte brisée, so there's no shortening in it.
Butter and vodka flour.
Exactly. So
a little salt.
You can see a lot more butter flecks all throughout it. I also probably didn't pulse, you know, the food processor as much, but I tend to like it to be pretty small. I think the two descriptions, we were kind of bouncing back and forth about ideas of how to describe it. So people say often in recipes to start off with a pea-sized butter, you know, when you start
when you're adding the liquid into finally adding the liquid into your pie crust, into the dough, it says make sure you don't add the liquid until the butter is a pea-sized amount. And we realized that in a food processor method, we actually don't want to go all the way to the pea-sized amount.
Because by the time you put the liquid in, the butter is
tiny.
nothing. And it won't be flaky because there's no butter to hit heat and then create that puff.
So we decided a chickpea was our preferred size.
It's a little bit bigger.
Yeah.
And then your goal at the end is like the size of a lentil.
Right.
And I mean, there's no perfect, but I did learn the hard way in the beginning that I had these giant pieces of butter.
Right.
And what ended up happening is that all the designs got really distorted. It's kind of like when you eat a pizza.
Right.
It has that huge bubble on it, which is kind of like my favorite. But in pie, it's not so good. So you want it to sort of maintain its shape, and when it hits the heat, that bubble happens and you lose shape. And it's nice, but it can make your dough kind of hard and crunchy, which maybe is obviously not tender and desirable.
So,
and I think you guys mentioned earlier that you can make a different dough for the decorative part as opposed to the other parts of the pie.
Yeah, I mean, there's no rules. You can do anything.
Yeah, well, as Judy mentioned, she added more butter to the leaves.
You know, I was also making a lot of dough. I mean, obviously not everyone's not going to make a lot of dough at the same time. But a little trick actually
along the line, because then you can pull it out.
I always make a double batch.
Yeah.
So I might make one to use for what I'm making that day, and then I have a spare that I put in the oven. To the freezer, and it keeps for a couple of months. So maybe mark it with a Sharpie or something. And there was something that we were talking about earlier. Was that to create to eliminate wastage? I like to form the dough. So here's actually a piece of dough. So it's a flat disc, and I would shape it into this form before I put it in the fridge to rest, and it would be for a round pie. But if I was going to make a rectangular galette, I'd form it actually into more of a rectangle so that when I'm rolling it out, there's less chance of it sort of
you want to keep that shape.
Yeah, it's a nice little cheat. I don't feel like any recipes tend to mention that, but I don't know. I feel like recipe writing is kind of fun when you take everything you learned and share that with everybody else.
Any other questions, or I think we might have
Yeah.
finished up here. So just to show everyone the final pie, and this, you know, as you can see, we still have extra of these twisted lattice.
Yeah, and you could keep those. You could put those in the freezer and then like thaw them out in the fridge
If
overnight.
my kids were home, what I would do is sprinkle them with cinnamon and sugar and then put them into the oven for a little treat.
You could also do like Parmesan straws.
That's
you could
true.
put some like black pepper and some Parmesan, maybe a little
cayenne.
I was like maybe Aleppo.
Yeah.
I feel like Aleppo pepper is really popular right now.
Yeah.
So, you know, we just want to encourage you guys to have fun and just go for it.
Thanks for joining, and thanks to Driscoll's.
Thanks to Driscoll's.